Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Friday, February 10th meeting of the Environmental Quality Commission. Our morning agenda today focuses on the conclusion of our recruitment efforts for the next director of the Department of Environmental Quality. We have time on the agenda this morning to do some follow-up questions from our work yesterday. And today's interview is scheduled for up to 30 minutes. When 5 minutes remain, a slide will be shown on the screen noting that time check. And today the commission may ask different questions of each finalist as they are follow-up questions to yesterday's interviews. And in fact, after discussing it, we have two questions that are going to be the same for each candidate, and then some individual questions that have more to do with their background and how they come to this recruitment effort. So welcome, Leah Feldon. And good morning. And do you have any questions for us before we begin these follow-up questions?
I don't think so. Thank you.
Okay, great. So Commissioner Kyle is going to start us off this morning.
Okay. And I just want to actually really start with thanking you for your time. Like, this is
Thank you.
a big event, clearly. And I just really appreciate the fact that you put yourself out there.
Thank you.
The first question really is that the Environmental Quality Commission prioritizes diversity, equity, and justice. And we've been asking you about your values and visions for a more diverse, inclusive, equitable, and just agency throughout this interview process, from the written to the oral to yesterday. So if you were selected as the director, what would you have, say, 3 actions you would do in the first year to change the culture within DEQ, more inclusive, and improve the retention of DEQ staff, especially staff from BIPOC communities? And I'm happy to read that.
Thank you for the question, Commissioner Kyle. This is, I don't want to say obviously, maybe it's obvious for me and for staff at the agency, but we've really been working on diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging issues at DEQ for a couple of years now. And I think just to start with a little bit of learning that we've had, the learning, I think, has been that unlike other issues, this is not something where you bring in some training and say, okay, we took the training, we got certified, we're done. That is not the case when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging. And as I alluded to yesterday and talked about a little bit, there's a lot of individual work that really needs to be done. And so that can be really hard when you're asking individuals to do something that is personal and individual in the workspace and to bring that to the workspace. So to be really transparent and honest, I think we're still figuring out exactly how to do that. But I do believe that there is an element of training that is needed. So the first thing is really to get that training out there. And again, that is not all we do. That's not the only thing, but it is really important because people are having different conversations in DEQ right now and at all different levels. And so what we really need to do is build an initial foundation just to help everyone to share some vocabulary, share some understanding of the racist history in Oregon, share some understanding of what some of our BIPOC staff and managers may be going through that others of us may not have seen, may not have understood. So that's the training piece. I think we need to continue with the affinity groups. I think those have provided a safe place for people to share ideas. And I think that's really important. I think leadership is going to be leaning in. I'm going to be asking, as a second piece, I'm going to be asking leadership to really lean in and not only is leadership going through that training right now, which I will ensure that we finish in the next, I believe we're going to be through our work in the next 6 months. But then leadership needs to start having those conversations with their managers. So we start infusing some of this throughout the agency and show that we're making a change at this agency, and that people are being called on to do some work themselves on an individual basis. The other thing that's important for us to recognize as leadership is just because we are leadership at the agency, we aren't the experts necessarily in this work. So we need to be curious ourselves and vulnerable and humble enough to ask for help. And so we can do that with consultants, and we can do that with folks within the agency. There's an issue there that we need to watch, which is how much we burden certain people in the agency, though, right? If you have a few BIPOC folks in the agency that are bearing the brunt of a lot of those discussions and those teachings and those explanations, there's a ton of labor going on there that a lot of us don't understand and don't see. There's invisible labor going on. And so I am calling on leadership to be cognizant of that as well. And that's why we all need to step into these discussions. Finally, and I mentioned this a bit yesterday, but the most important thing that we are going to need to do is start bridging some of the different conversations we're having. We're having some conversations, really great conversations in strategic planning around DEI and anti-racism. We're having conversations around DEI and anti-racism in the DEI Council. We're having those conversations in leadership, but we really haven't bridged these efforts in an agency-wide manner yet. I should also mention we're having these discussions in recruitment and retention efforts. But we really need to start bridging these efforts. The last concrete thing I will mention that's really important, our DEI coordinator position is vacant right now. And we know that it was the person who had it previously, it was the first time we've ever had a coordinator, and we've had one person in it so far. And it was a very challenging position to be in. And so we need to take a step back and take a look at that position and reconsider how do we best support that position so that it can be successful. So that's the next most important thing I think we need to do around that position and for the DEI work going forward. That's where we need to go. And I'm going to be working with leadership to help get us there.
I know time is tight, but I'd like to do a quick follow-up on that. Does that sound all right with folks? So thank you for that, Leah. And that being said, to do what you just suggested, to support that position and empower them to be a leader in this change, there'll have to be a change in culture at DEQ, to a culture that, supports and promotes and empowers the kind of dialogue and the kind of looking through DEQ's work from a different lens. And there will have to be a way in which people will be held accountable when harm occurs to people who've been traditionally marginalized and may not have found DEQ to be such a welcoming place for them. Could you say just a little bit about that culture change and about accountability at DEQ?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, again, kind of going back to harms that some of us may not have seen. First of all, the first culture change that I'm calling upon for DEQ, for all staff at DEQ, is to believe your coworkers. We're a data-driven agency. There's a lot of scientists, there's lawyers, there's folks that rely on evidence in their entire lives and in their outlook and their paradigm. So I think for some, it may be hard to believe or accept that there could be racism or aggressions going on in this agency. I think some may not want to accept that as an identity. And so the first step really is to rid ourselves of that non-acceptance and simply believe. and be curious and open up conversations with coworkers about their experiences. And we're going to have to be really strong in holding people accountable for harm and for microaggressions. So I will be working with HR to ensure that we do that. A culture change is going to have to mean that people see accountability and that people don't continue to experience the same thing over and over. That will not be tolerated at this agency.
Thank you.
Okay. Leah, this question's kind of focused on leadership and your role as an administrator. In a time of potentially a time of reduced natural resource agency budgets and increased programmatic demands on the agency, how would you prioritize and work to prevent backslide at DEQ and to prevent more burnout of staff?
Thank you, Commissioner Addington. Definitely appreciate that question. And burnout of staff and management and leadership is a topic that we have at DEQ. And for those who've been around, as most of this commission has, and many of our staff for the last few budget cycles, the last few biennia, we've received a fair amount of new work, new programs. And what I try and remind folks that are in charge of state budgets is that we're grateful for that work. It's within our authority and it moves Oregon forward. And we're grateful for the resources that came with that new work. But they were not resources to support the work that we already had. They were resources for the new work. And so we do have several programs where resources are still needed for the work that we've been doing all along, basic permitting work, and ensuring that when new businesses want to come to Oregon, they can get a timely permit, and they're going to have help in that permit process, and they're going to be able to understand how to get through that process in a timely fashion and not play a game of wrong rock with us. So I think my philosophy and how I've operated since I've been in the role of deputy director and interim is to be really transparent about our resource needs. Our agency request budget is always going to reflect what we really need in those programs. And I'm contrasting that with at times historically, a while ago, I think we would try and predict or crystal ball what would be what we could get or what might be appropriate in that particular biennium. And to me, that's not really letting folks know, hey, we're struggling in this area. We've been given this responsibility and we don't have enough staff to do it. So I'm always going to be very transparent about the resources that we need and make sure that people understand that there's a give and take. When we don't have enough resources in a certain area, certain things aren't going to get done. And in terms of ensuring that we don't burn people out, we have to continue the conversation and find ways to prioritize and take things off the plate. When we are not funded for something, we have to stop doing it. And then we have to make that conversation transparent. It would be my job to make sure that I'm talking to legislators and I'm talking to the governor's office and saying, this isn't funded anymore and we really can't do it. And I want you to be aware of that. So I absolutely see that as a primary role for the director. The director is one of the few people that actually can speak to that, I think, in just a really open and honest way. Prioritizing within DEQ, we're hoping to do that through some of our strategic planning work that we have started, but that we need to keep moving on. Strategic planning is one of the governor's priorities and expectations of all agencies. And so we are expected to have that plan by June 2024.
Thank you.
And I have a question that is I get to ask two today. So you've been at DEQ for 17 years, which is incredibly admirable. But how would you infuse new ideas into the agency, given that, so much of your career has been here?
Yes, thank you, Commissioner Kyle. That's a great question. I think, to be fair, there are advantages and disadvantages, to someone coming into this role who's been in the agency for a long time versus someone who hasn't and would come in with a completely fresh perspective. And I really recognize that. And I've been thinking a lot about that. How do I make sure that that we don't get stuck as an agency just because some of my ideas have been there and in a leadership role in terms of being deputy and interim director over the last 6.5 years or so. I think the advantages are that I can hit the ground running and I know where we have areas that we need to improve and shore up. And I know which areas are areas of strength. So that's on the advantage side. But what I really want to do if I were to become director is take an opportunity for a fresh start, is to sit down really with the leadership team and say, let's really start this anew. You have a new director. Regardless of who it is, it's a new director. It's a new era of leadership. And frankly, staff and management should expect some things to look different and new and refreshed. My philosophy, my way of leading is one of collaboration. And I think even as I say that word, it gets a little overused, but I enjoy a team approach to leadership. I do not enjoy being out there just solely by myself. I have a strong leadership team. I've worked hard to help develop that leadership team over the last 6.5 years. And they're there because they're experts in their areas. They're there because they rose to the top to get into those positions. And I'm going to rely on that team. And they all have perspectives that I don't have. So we are going to keep innovating and keeping things fresh by drawing on different ideas. We also have new staff coming into the agency all the time, and they are going to have fresh perspectives on ways to do things. And of course, we're going to continue to reach out to communities and stakeholders to find out where do they see issues, where do they perceive as areas that we need to innovate and do things better. But I think at the core, it's not a reliance just on your own ideas. It's knowing that you're not in a position of leadership because you know everything. You call upon your team for advice and ideas in their areas of expertise.
Yeah. Those are 3 follow-up questions for you. Okay. We want to thank you very much for just spending a little bit more time with us this morning. You do your best to pick the few questions you can fit in to an interview. But then there's always a few things you think, well, what about this? And what about that? And so we appreciate you spending a little bit more time with us this morning so we can just follow up on a few items and really appreciate it.
Thank you, Chair George. Thank you, commissioners. And I just want to thank all of you for what has been, from my perspective, on the outside for a change, really a great process. And I know there's been a ton of work done by all of you, and in particular, Commissioner Kyle and Chair George and all of our HR staff. So I just want to really appreciate such a great process, and I appreciate being a part of this process, and have great faith in this commission to make a great decision. So I look forward to the future. Thanks.
Thanks again.
Thank you, Leah.
All right, and now we have just a short little kind of transition break here. So maybe will we turn off the mics during this 5-minute kind of transition?
Chair George, this is Stephanie Caldera, your commission assistant. We are scheduled to begin the second interview with Jamie McLeod-Skinner at 9:05 this morning. So you have a few extra minutes for a break. We can pause the recording during that time.
That's right. Yeah, we didn't actually use up all that time, but with only 3 questions, I didn't think we needed it. So that sounds great. Yes, we will expect to be back live at 9:05. Thank you. Welcome, everybody. We are going to get underway in just 1 minute here. I just have a minor bit of business. I need to hand off some materials, and then we will get underway with our second follow-up session. Go ahead, Jennifer, please come over. My apologies for that slight delay, right?
It's all part of the work.
Paperwork does just, insert itself sometimes. And so I apologize for that short delay. Thank you for spending some more time with us this morning to just have a few follow-up sessions, as I'm sure you've experienced in your own conducting of interviews. You do your very best to come up with the best questions you can in the time you have allotted. And then afterwards, you sit down to discuss, and a few other things just come up and you say, I wish I'd probed a little bit more about this or that. So we have this time this morning to follow up. Wonderful. So we have, I think, 3 follow-up questions for you. 2 are the same follow-up questions that we asked Leah Feldon, and 1 for each of you is a bit unique, having more to do with your own personal background and experience. All right, wonderful. So we'll get underway, and Commissioner Kyle, you have the first question.
I do. And first of all, I just want to really thank you for applying. It takes a lot to put yourself out there, especially in a public interview process like this. So just want to say thank you for doing it. It's really important. As you know, the EQC prioritizes diversity, equity, and justice, and we've been asking you questions about your values, about that throughout the process, your written interviews, your first round of interviews, and then also yesterday. So this is a follow-up question with that. So if you were selected as the director, what would be, say, your top 3 actions you would do in that first year to change the culture within DEQ to be more inclusive and improve the retention of DEQ staff, especially staff from BIPOC communities?
Yeah, great question, because it's exciting that there's now a focus on these 2 positions that are the EJ positions that are really important. But what we often see is in the falling short of DEI work is the lack of support or, responsibility without authority. It's got to come from the top, and it cannot be an isolated responsibility of 2 people. It's got to be the entire organization. And so that commitment to leading, to incorporate, to literally the seat at the table is really important. And then just establishing that that's part of the culture, that's part of the expectation, that's part of the organizational value. So having that conversation, trying to get an understanding where, change is challenging, change is tough, and sometimes feels threatening. So it's got to make it really clear that it shouldn't be threatening. Change can be really embraced and be a great thing. And there's some great trainings out there. There's a professor from Morehouse College who talks about implicit bias, and it's natural in all of us. It's part of how we survive. It's not something to feel threatened by. And so finding ways to have these conversations and take in that different people have different experiences, and also wanting to create safe space for folks. This is something I have some lived experience with. I came out as a young adult, and, we are in a much safer time now, although the tide is starting to reverse for the LGBTQ community. And this experience, the experience of trying to thrive in an environment that's not necessarily hospitable is something I personally have experience with. And so it's also very personal for me that others don't have that experience. But I've learned a tremendous amount from it, and it's helped me to better understand both the experience of it, but also other people's experience, because, the LGBTQ experience is very different from the BIPOC community, fundamentally different from our tribal nations and the historical injustices that have been put in place. So having an appreciation for our history and respect for that, having an understanding. But I will say often, here in rural communities, there's often rural folks will say, well, there's also a bias against us. So And in some cases, that's compounded by also being a BIPOC person in a rural area. So people not being threatened by the conversation and having it be part of our everyday conversation is really important. One of the things we done on OWEB, and I serve as the co-chair of the Water and Climate Committee. First and foremost, in the climate resolution we move forward, we wanted to make sure that moving forward on climate action was not at the expense of our DEI work, because sometimes there's a disconnect or conflict being within those communities. So that was something we put to that resolution. But on we made a standing agenda item to incorporate a conversation about DEI, because one of the things that OWEB went through was this trying to be supportive of DEI, but do you have just a DEI committee that it's their kind of responsibility and no one else's, or how do you incorporate this to the culture of the organization? And so there's been a bit of back and forth in that. So it's important to have people who are focused on that role, but it's also important for it to be the job of every single employee of DEQ to be focused on this is part of our job. And it's really about reaching out and serving all Oregonians. It's just about a level playing field. And so putting in that context, understanding discomfort with it is really helpful. And to also just give you an example of experience, excuse me, that I serve on an ESD, an education service district in Jefferson County, a very rural county in Central Oregon, and actually very diverse. It incorporates part of Warm Springs, and so we have a large Indigenous population, a large Latino, Latinx population, and also it's about a third in Caucasian. And a year or so ago, when there was a discussion of racial justice and equity, it was more of a discussion in our public policy. I served as part of a statewide body that helped to develop a racial justice and equity policy. And when school districts and ESD boards were looking at incorporating that policy, it blew up statewide. We've seen people get fired and recalls and all this tremendous tension around it. I'm very proud to say the Jefferson County ESD, which includes some of my colleagues who are very conservative, it was passed unanimously. And we recently talked about it in light of an issue that came up that was not directly ESD responsibility, but light of an issue that came up around summer camps. And one of our partner school boards pulling their students out of summer camps. We got there, it was not an easy path at all, but it was about developing relationships with your colleagues, having those really difficult, sometimes painful conversations, but then also getting the focus on the needs of our kids in our community. And it was a process, but by getting there, we were able to pass it. And it was something I led passage of, and I'm really proud of that. And I'm proud of my colleagues who put politics aside and focused on the needs of our kids. But that was not happening across the state. And in Jefferson County I love my neighbors. I love living there. But it's also a very conservative county that often throws that discussion into a political discussion instead of how can we make a better community. The retention piece is really important. This is important for all staff, but especially for our BIPOC staff. And being really honest and frank about the history of Oregon, this has been there's a horrific history with regard to our Black community, with regard to our Indigenous communities. And so being really aware about that history. And again, politics often threw people in a position to create that conflict. So we're not trying to, we can't change the past, but we can be aware of it and we can be honest about it. And we can see how that's created tensions where we're at now. And know that we have to create safe space and supportive space for folks to want to stay. Again, that's true for all employees, but that's especially true for those who come from communities who have felt traditionally targeted and do not feel othered in the space that's created. And when I was a kid, actually, my mom took a teaching job in Tanzania, East Africa. And so for a period of time, I went to the government school where she taught. So I was very much not in the majority. And I had a very positive experience. I was very fortunate to have that experience. But it's also, when you're not in the majority. And that experience can be very positive or very negative. So we've done things, other organizations I've worked with, when I worked for a regional water agency, we really leaned into employee resource groups, ERGs, because it's also important to create space for folks to be in the majority space and to feel supported in that. And so, I know there's some statewide statewide support for this work. I'm not familiar internally with the level of work within DEQ, but that kind of work. And again, it's also reaching out, sitting down with folks and listening, because the greatest system on paper, if it doesn't work for you personally, it's not going to work for you personally. So getting an understanding of what really works. So that's part of a conversation. It's part of a conversation with employees. It's part of a conversation with management staff of also making sure that management is responsive to the needs of frontline employees and understand there's some natural tensions there. Big organizations, that's natural. There's different divisions. There's different organizational cultures in those divisions, but there's also some truisms across the board. And the bottom line is people are drawn to this organization because it's a remarkable organization with a phenomenal mission. It's a visionary mission. It's legacy work for our state. Honoring that and making space for people who bring their special expertise, whether it's a cultural expertise, whether it's a professional expertise, to that discussion, that mission is a key piece of the job.
Okay, Jamie, this question goes to your leadership and role as an administrator. In a time of potentially reduced natural resource agency budgets and increased programmatic demands on DEQ, how would you prioritize the work to prevent backslide of the agency and to prevent more burnout of staff?
Yeah, this is really key right now because we're coming out of time of COVID. There's a lot of change. If there's a change of leadership, that creates some tension and some anxiety. I'm frankly really hoping that I really honor and respect and my colleague who's also applying, and I'm hoping that we can find a way to almost get a twofer for the agency to really incorporate and bring those values and those skills in. So there's that sense of confidence and support within the agency. It's being aware of workload. People can only bring so much. Being able to bring their whole self to work, and that was part of the DEI discussion, but also people are passionate about this work. We don't have to question that. We have to make space and support so that people can feel like whole people and do this work well. Because you can't, if you're burned out, you can't do a good job no matter how passionate you are about it. And so people have their own lives and they have their engagement in the community and respecting all that, this sense of identity, respecting those pieces, knowing how much we can do. There's way too much work for the resources we have, that going in. And so it's looking at the resources that we do get and making sure we're allocating those, and that prioritization piece, we touched on that a little bit yesterday, is really key. And that is partially a sense of the mission and vision that you all have laid out. It's also the governor's agenda, making sure we're part of speaking with one voice as a statewide agency. And also, very importantly, it's sitting down and talking with management staff. It's talking with the team and figuring out what is doable. And in agencies I've worked with before, what we've had is these things called study issues, where you look at all the different things. And this is something that we could be even talking about on an annual basis for all of you, talking about all the different things that you want to do in the next year. And then looking at the energy resource and what that's going to take of staff and having a prioritization process. So we're all on the same page about what are the top priorities and actually having a line. And that then put me in the tough role, sometimes sitting in front of you and say, you know what? It's a great idea. We can't do it all. We can't do it all. And in that way, I need to protect staff and have their back to make sure that not too much is asked of them. And, just personally, I never ask more of others than I do myself. I work my heart out to make sure that I'm seeing where those gaps are and helping to support people along the way. But we will not be successful if the team does not feel supported and we don't have the resources necessary. And that really takes us to what is, job one of this role is the central services, the policy and external relations, the DEI work, the EJ work, the climate work. In the next 4 months, job one is getting as many resources we can to move forward. So yes, our budget is now, the governor's budget is now our budget. And that's about 5% less than the agency requested budget. And we have a political process to go through. And so I think what's really important, what I bring to the table is a real comfort in that environment with the folks involved and with that process to make sure we're getting every penny we can so that we can provide the necessary positions, the necessary equipment, when some of the requests for changes and improvements to equipment, and just the resources necessary to our job. So that's on our side of it. The other piece is what we can do together, the leveraging with other natural resource agencies, with our partner agencies on the ground, with our non-traditional partner organizations. And that's why the relationship piece is so important. Yes, it's to expand what we do and improve the reputation. And I'm not saying it's bad, but I'm saying there is this sense of really organizations seeing it as a shared mission. And leveraging those resources. So working to create a shared overall vision of the natural resource and through the governor's office. I mean, the restructuring has actually really sets the stage for this. And with some of our partner organization with tribal nations across the state. So developing that understanding of building up those relationships, building up a shared vision, and then knowing all the different roles that we individually play and how the things that we do, the things we support and being done, and things we encourage others to do. I mean, this mission of looking at groundwater, huge crisis now in Morrill County. And we talked yesterday about trying to prevent other things from becoming crises, but it's also how we're working with our partner agencies to again, what's the vision? What's our piece in the vision, how we can support our partners in doing it. One of the remarkable things I've seen that has come out of partnerships, and I think of organizations like High Desert Partnership, is that moving beyond the perceived conflicts or the traditional conflicts, and really developing that shared vision, working together collaboratively to accomplish that. The thing, as the expression goes, you're more than the sum of your parts. That potential is there. There is so much work to be done. We are in a time of climate crisis. I can, tell you from having, when I first went into Talent after the fire, and I finished high school less than 10 miles away, so I knew the area well. It reminded me of my time in Bosnia and Kosovo, the level of damage. That's what communities are facing right now, and us being a partner to make sure our economy is strong, make sure our resources are protected, is part and parcel of the job. So that's the challenge of management. You've got a lot to do, not enough resources, that prioritization, communicating with you all, bringing things before you, asking for your take on what are the top priorities, and having a mechanism to do that, and being the conduit between staff and yourselves in terms of setting, that what's urgent, what's important, how do we prioritize? And just lastly, we have federal mandates. We have the ultimate mission of protecting that regulation piece. That's absolute. And how do we do that and build these other pieces in to accomplish that?
Thank you. All right, your last question. You had mentioned in your answers previously, you made reference to some of your previous runs for political office. What would you say to somebody if they were concerned that as director, you would be perceived as bringing a partisan perspective to the director's role?
Well, one of the actual criticisms I've received in running for office is that I'm not political enough. In that, what I've typically said, and people have heard me say across the state and across the region, is that regardless of political party, we all want to be able to put a roof overhead and food on our table. We want opportunities for our kids. We don't want our homes to burn down. Those truisms are what brings together. It's what motivated me to serve and to run for office. And so that background, that experience is both a plus in that a lot of the relationships and a lot of the comfort in a political setting. Yes, this role is a small p political, not a capital P. It is not like yourself, a policymaker. It is an implementer of policy. But the fact of the matter is, everything this agency does is political. The decision you made back in December, which was a very important decision around addressing climate impacts, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, is a phenomenally political discussion. And so not being able to lean into those conversations and navigate and be in those spaces and communicate with people around why that is important. If you can't do that, the agency will fail, that mission will fail. And so what I think my past experience brings is the understanding of that environment, the ability to do that work of reaching out and connecting with people. And then it will just, people will see from the work being done that it's about caring for the state, caring for our environment, caring for current and future generations, making sure our businesses can thrive in a way that does not have a negative impact on our environment. That is my track record. That's my past in terms of my professional experience. And even in when I have had those political conversations, that's been the context I've set. And so, yeah, it's been actually that work that's gotten me out. And one of the reasons why I'm such a strong believer in building relationships and really showing up and listening around the state, because when you talk to someone one-on-one, when we're not in an election cycle and you show up and you listen, you hear people's concerns, 99.9% of the time, people aren't talking about politics. They're talking about the issue in their community. They're talking about broadband. They're talking about clean water. They're talking about access to resources. They're talking about their local economy. They're talking about housing. That's what people care about. And this was actually, I think it was about a little over a year ago in Central Oregon. There's of course a terrible drought crisis going on around our state, and it's really in Central Oregon. And there are folks who are looking for to utilize these tensions and these crises in our communities to cause political strife. We saw it in Harney County, the Maui occupation, and there was individuals who helped to stir up that conflict who went to Klamath and tried to stir up that conflict between people, between tribes in the community, between farmers and tribes. We know that tension's out there. The ability to have relationships and go into that space and be a calming force is critically important to be able to keep this work moving forward. I mean, look at the removal of Klamath dams. There is tension in politics around that. Being able to go into the community and dampen that tension is really important. So specifically, some of these same individuals who are looking to stir up conflict were down in Klamath, and were trying to do that about a year and a half ago when they were not successful. And I give tremendous credit to folks in the Klamath region to say, no, we're struggling with this. We are in crisis, but we're going to work together on this to get through it. A lot of those individuals came to Central Oregon, and we're trying to essentially stir up that conflict in Central Oregon. And so I actually drew together and co-facilitated some private conversations with folks across the political spectrum, private conversations with some of the water agencies, the water districts, trying to see if we could get resources to address the crises. I also tried to do some of this work through OWEB, see what OWEB could do, these conversations internally with the director, in trying to mitigate the conflict rather than have it explode. And there was in August of year before last, there was a very high profile meeting. It was supposed to be 50 people, over 500 people showed up at the fairgrounds in Redmond. And I was there. So you're talking politics. I'm affiliated with one party, and most of the folks there were affiliated with a different party. And I was sitting next to some farmers who were really hard hit in Jefferson County. And a gentleman came up in full political regalia, shall we say, and of a party that's not associated with my own. And he was coming up to talk to the folks sitting next to me, and he saw me, he did a double take, and he said, "Is that our favorite party affiliation?" And I just kind of laughed, and he very much identified with a different political party. But even the folks I was sitting next to say, you show up, you understand our issues, you care about the community. And that is how I am known in the communities I've worked in. I think that's ultimately what you're looking for. So someone who can step into the political realm, because this job is the outward facing job. This job is about having those relationships and being able to engage people. For some, they'll need to see, and I'll need to show that. That's something I'm very comfortable doing. But in the places and times I've showed up, in the conversations I've had, that's what people know me for, is focusing on how we bring people together to solve our problems. It's the work I've done And I appreciate that. I have run for office, so there would be some, it's a very fair question. But I think my track record shows that this bridging divides and bringing people together, which is something that I'm very passionate about. In the work I've done is what I'm known for in the circles where with folks who know me and know the work I do.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Jamie. Well, those are the questions we have for you. And just as Commissioner Kyle began, I want to conclude this portion of our work as well by just thanking you and thanking Leah Feldon.
Yeah.
It truly is no small thing to step up and apply and put yourself out for position of this sort. And it also has been quite a process. And so we thank you and all the applicants for the energy and the time that they invested in this important process. And I'm really pleased that we got, a nice wide pool of applicants and that we have such a well-qualified final candidate. So again, thanks to both you and Leah for your time.
Thank you so much. Really
Thank
appreciate that. Thank you.
Thanks, Jamie.
And Chair George and commissioners, at this time, we will stop the recording as the commission moves to a break and executive session. The commission will reconvene at 10:20.
Thank you very much. Thank you.